All right, today we are jumping headfirst into one of the biggest, oldest, and most difficult questions humanity has ever asked itself, the problem of evil. And we're going to explore an answer that is, well, it's pretty radical. It doesn't just try to solve the puzzle, it completely flips the board over and redefines God himself.
And this is it, right? The classic question that keeps so many people up at night. You've probably thought about it yourself. If there's a being out there who is supposedly all good and can do literally anything, then why all of this? Why doesn't that being just stop the pain, the suffering, the horror we see all the time? It's a massive crack in the foundation of faith for a lot of people.
So here's what makes Process Theodicy so fascinating. It doesn't come up with some new excuse or a complicated explanation for why God allows suffering. Instead, it takes a step back and says, what if the question itself is wrong? What if we've been working from a flawed understanding of who or what God actually is? This reframes the entire conversation. Okay, so for millennia, the traditional view in classical theism has been built on this one core idea, creatio ex nihilo. It's Latin for creation from nothing. The logic goes like this. Because God created the entire universe out of absolute nothingness, he must have total ultimate power over it. He's omnipotent. This single idea is the bedrock that Process Theodicy decides to take a sledgehammer to.
And the first crack in that bedrock comes from a surprising place. Theologian David Ray Griffin points to an alternative but perfectly valid translation of the very first line of the Bible. Now look closely at the wording here. The earth being without form and void. See that? In this reading, the world already exists when God shows up. It's just a chaotic mess. God doesn't create the raw materials. He finds them.
And that one little change in translation leads to this massive redefinition. Process Theodicy argues that God's great act of creation wasn't making something out of nothing. It was more like a divine artist taking a lump of pre-existing, eternal, chaotic clay and beginning the long, slow process of shaping it. This means God isn't an all-powerful dictator of matter, but something much different, a divine persuader. And if God's main tool isn't absolute power but persuasion, well, that changes everything. It completely transforms how we think about divine power itself. It's a shift from total control to something way more collaborative, you could say. Let's break down what that really means.
So on one side, you've got coercive power. This is brute force. It's domination, it's control, it's the ability to overpower any resistance. That's the classical, omnipotent God. But on the other side, you have persuasive power. This is about influence, encouragement. It can't just force its will on things. It requires some level of consent, of buy-in. It respects the freedom of the thing it's trying to influence. And that is the process God.
This completely rewires the relationship between God and the universe. The model is called panentheism, the idea that the universe is in God, kind of like a body, and God is its soul. So God isn't some distant king on a throne, separate from creation. He's in it with us. He experiences the world's joy, but also its pain. And crucially, this means he can't just force away evil. He can't just snap his fingers and stop a cancer cell from dividing or a tectonic plate from shifting, because those low-grade bits of matter don't have the capacity to really listen to his persuasion. Now, you might be thinking, a limited God? Why would anyone find that appealing? And that's a fair question. But for some people, this model actually provides a huge sense of relief and solves some really deep emotional and logical problems. Let's look at the strengths of this idea. First and foremost, the appeal is incredibly powerful because it gives a straight, simple answer to the problem of evil. A good God doesn't stop suffering because he literally cannot. He doesn't have the coercive power to do it. This removes that awful thought that God is just standing by, watching us suffer and choosing not to intervene. It also gives you a God who truly gets it, a God who feels our pain because he's feeling it too. He becomes a fellow sufferer who understands. And for many, it's easier to have a relationship with a God who is in the trenches with you than with one who is watching from a safe distance. But, and this is a huge but, this idea of a limited God opens up a whole new can of worms. If God isn't all-powerful, what does that really mean for us? For a lot of people, this is where the concept goes from being comforting to being, well, frankly, terrifying. I mean, the criticisms are just as compelling as the appeals. First off, is it God who isn't all-powerful even worthy of worship? If God is just as helpless as we are in the face of some great evil, does that bring you comfort, or does it just lead to shared despair? And think about this. With a process God, there's no guarantee that good will win in the end. None. And there's no promise of a heaven where all the wrongs will be made right. The innocent who suffer,
just suffer. And this quote from the philosopher Brian Davies just nails the core objection. If this theology offers no real solution to our helplessness, if God is, as Davies puts it, also in the soup with us, then why worship him? It's a really sharp and powerful critique. So, this entire debate, all these complex ideas, really boil down to one final, incredibly stark choice. And that choice becomes razor sharp when we apply it to the most extreme example of evil we can possibly imagine: the Holocaust. This is where the philosopher John Roth really pushes process theodicy to its absolute breaking point, setting up this intense philosophical showdown with David Ray Griffin. Roth's argument is just devastating. He says, look, if the process God is real, then you have to accept that the absolute best this God could do with all his persuasive power was to let the Holocaust happen, to let thousands die every single day. And a God that is that impotent, Roth argues, is morally outrageous and is not worthy of anyone's worship. But Griffin's comeback is just as powerful. He completely slips the script. He says the problem isn't my God's lack of power, the problem is the traditional God's character. The choice isn't between a weak God and a strong one, it's about which one is morally acceptable. And he ends with this absolutely blistering line: Yin Roth finds my God too small to evoke worship. I find his too gross. And that is the choice, laid bare. It's absolutely brutal when you see it like this. On one hand, you have the classical God, a being who could have stopped the absolute worst evils in human history, but chose not to. On the other hand, you have the process God, a being who would have given anything to stop those evils, but simply couldn't. So in the end, that's the question process theodicy leaves us with: a God who is all-powerful but morally questionable, or a God who is all good but tragically limited? A monster or an impotent friend? There's no easy answer here, and it really makes you wonder, what kind of God, if any, could possibly be worthy of faith in a world like ours?